Hey everyone, so glad you're here. This is an episode with Andrew Fanning. I don't know if you've heard of Doughnut Economics or the Doughnut Economics Action Lab or a woman named Kate Raworth, but I had not heard of any of these things until about, I don't know, maybe it's been a year now, but it's really changed my whole understanding of economics. And a lot of us find that word a little bit scary, economics, for all kinds of reasons, but I've been trying to approach it differently and understand it. I didn't study economics, of course. I studied philosophy and literature and neuroscience, but I've started to understand that economics is something we all maybe need to study and think about because there's a lot of new possibilities for what we could imagine as economics, but it's going to take all of us to do it. And these people I just named, who we talk about in this episode, are helping us find new ways. Andrew's working with the Doughnut Action Lab. He's part of it. He's working with Kate Raworth. She wrote a book, best-selling book, and has a best viewing TED Talk about it. I'll link to all that below, but this is just a good introduction to start to think about economics a little differently, to understand the difference between 20th and 21st century potentials, to understand the difference between traditional economics and environmental economics within that subset and something called ecological economics. I was a little fuzzy about all of this, but Andrew helps me clarify and understand some of it. So I hope that helps some of you too, although maybe all of you are already experts, in which case it's still a very interesting conversation because we talk about how it relates to life and our goals. And Andrew says something which really stuck with me, which is that it's wonderful to have these exciting ideas like the donut, and also to have all these people who inspire us, these big names who speak from stages and platforms about such things and get millions of views. This is wonderful. However, what really changes things for many of us is encountering this in our everyday life. Maybe it's our teacher who tells us about it, or maybe it's our friend who tells us about it, or maybe we see it in our local city government. So those are the places that the change really starts. And this is about what's possible, what's the desirable unknown that we don't see that we can bring into the known, the quadrant of the known. And I think Andrew and Kate and the Doughnut Action Lab are one path towards that process becoming more exciting and clarifying. There are many other paths too, but here's one, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. And also feel free to tell me other paths that you've seen and noticed relative to economics, either in your own life or in your country. Anyway, that you've come across something new, I'd love to hear about it. And I hope you're doing well wherever you're making your way today. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. Hi, Andrew. I'm so excited to talk to you today. Thanks for doing this.
No, thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
To be honest, I'm sort of thrilled because it's one of those learning experiences for me, learning about economics in a new way over this past few years. So there's a lot I want to get into, your own work, your own papers, but I thought we'd start with the donut and with DIL, the Action Lab, because that's sort of what brought us together, how I found you. And to do that, I thought we're going to talk about the donut, for those who have no idea what I'm talking about. But I want to start with Kate Raworth's book. I think it's from 2017 about the donut model of economics, and the subtitle of it, which is 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. I think that's right.
That's right.
Okay. So first, I want to try to get into why economics matters, why we should care. And to do that, I want to think about what's different about a 21st century economist instead of like a 20th century or 19th century. What's this about? Was there a change?
For me, there's been a change. I wish that change I mean, it's growing, I would say. I think there's also quite a lot of work that still needs to be done. I think that 20th century economics, as it has been taught by departments of economics in universities worldwide, is still all too often being taught. And what Kate's book really does is it lays out, as the subtitle suggests, these 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist by essentially identifying what 20th century economics does across 7 different levels. And I mean, it's difficult to go through each of those with any justice right now, but I guess the first one is talking about we need to change the goal of 20th century economics, which is a funny thing because at a macroeconomic level, which is macroeconomics is of course the study of the whole economy and all of its interrelations. It's a funny thing that there is no stated goal within traditional macroeconomics. It's just sort of like we want to identify how households and businesses and governments and trade and finance interact. And there's been a very, very influential model called the circular flow model, where if you've ever taken an economic class, it's this idea usually presented as households and businesses that of course, businesses want to make goods and services which households buy, and households provide labor in order as part of the means of production. And so there's this circular flow of value between households and businesses, is how we teach it in first year, well, how it is taught in first year economics. But of course, that's missing key parts. It's missing the government, of course. So like, how does the government tax and spend and provide, more public goods? It's missing international trade, like how do we trade with our neighbors and, imports and exports. And it's also missing banks, like how do we borrow, how do we invest, how do we save, and so on and so on. So this more complicated, that's as complicated as that model gets. And it's actually been quite useful because it forms the basis of what's known as the system of national accounts, which is where, that's how gross domestic product or GDP and all of the interactions that take place in our economy are tracked and accounted for and measured. And the whole idea of the model, of course, is that everything balances, right? It's all moving around, and that provides these kind of policy levers, which is really, really powerful for policymakers because you can say, instead of looking at the millions and millions of interactions and exchanges and transactions that are occurring in the economy, you can say, well, we should look at if we want to have an influence on saving, then we can look at the interest rate. If we want to have an influence on spending, then we might need to tax more or tax less or and so on and so on. So that's been very, very useful.
So
But one of
this is 20th century or 21st century? Where are we? This is
so,
like an
so this
old.
is 20th century economics. It's called the
Okay.
circular flow model. It forms the backbone of macroeconomic policy. And I would
Okay.
argue that it served a lot of good purpose in the 20th century. But of course,
Okay.
like any model,
Mm-hmm.
it's what's that classic quote by George Box, I think his name is all models are wrong, but some are useful, or something like that.
Right, right.
Uh,
So sorry, the sun is like flooding me right now, so I was trying to close the window, but
as
um
I as I speak about 20th century
I
economics,
know suddenly, yeah, exactly.
like,
So here, this is where like I'm still learning, so bear with me here, but I hear a lot about the circular economy and this idea of regeneration and all of this seems connected to donut economics and so on. And that seems very different from the way that I've imagined classical economics, the 20th or 19th century even economics. But you're talking about a circle now, and that
and
feels
that is
confusing
not
to me. Yeah.
okay. Okay, so those are very, very different things,
Okay.
I would say. We can get into circular economics, circular economy, and regenerative economics, and that idea maybe in a little bit,
Yeah.
but just for
I
now,
guess
it's
what's the
it's quite different.
orientation of that because when you were describing that, I'm thinking about, well, most people think of that as how much money can I make and how do I make the most profit and how do I have a successful business that is on this kind of linear mindset of making more money, the more money the business makes, the more the household makes. And that's what I'm seeing as like fueling that circle that you're talking about. Is that
That's
fair
that's a
or?
great, I mean, that's really where I was headed next, is the main ecological economics critique of that model is that if you look at things in nature, everything needs a fuel source. It needs to be powered by something. There's no such thing as a perpetual motion machine. Things just don't go around in a circle by themselves. And
Right.
so what that model is, of course, missing and has been pointed out for decades, is, what is powering that circular flow is, of course, matter and energy, which are provided from the sun or from the earth, from the planet that we live on. And we're completely dependent on those sources of materials and energy to power our economies and our society. And likewise, that the planet, as well as, radiant heat that's
Mm-hmm.
let off after we're done using things, is another part of that. So there's the linear throughput or the linear flow that's powering almost the circular flow of exchange in the typical model. And so what ecological economists have done, one of my heroes is Herman Daly. He spent his essentially his career drawing a square around that circle. And the square, of course, is
Huh.
the ecosphere, the planet. And it recognizes that, the economy is not just some thing, circular flow sitting in a void.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually completely embedded within and dependent upon the finite planet that we live in. Because if you
Mm.
live in a void, then what you were just mentioning earlier, you can always just keep accumulating and keep growing because your growth doesn't displace
Mm.
anything else, right? You can
Yeah,
just, if
right.
you're sitting in a void, but we're
Yeah,
not sitting.
so that's very helpful because so we have this idea of like the ecosystem and the cycle and so on. So we're always thinking in these patterns of circulars and loops, and it can be very easy to just imagine that's how nature works somehow, that like everything's just naturally powered. And maybe it is, aside from human resources, that would be a whole other discussion, but it can get really confusing that that's what growth is, that it's just happening. And so you always want more and more and more, but nature's not necessarily doing more and more and more. It's more, the life cycle is actually, life and death, right? But we don't remember, we don't think about this changing transformation where some things lose their form or stays the same or homeostasis and all of this. We don't think of that in those economic models, at least like from my very uninformed perspective. For me, as an
Yeah.
American, it's felt like you must always grow. The stock market is built on that. And so it's interesting to try to like pull that apart a little bit and what's natural and what's not. And yeah,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I would say that this goal of growth at the macroeconomic level, it comes out of, it's almost an accident in from a theoretical perspective. So my background was I took a master's in development economics. I'm a recovering economist, if you will, of the formal school. So what kind of formal departments of economics would typically focus on is more the microeconomic interactions. And there, the theory has its flaws and its assumptions and its problems. But in general, there's kind of a type of an equilibrium. The classic first image in economics that you would see is typically the supply and demand meeting in a market. And
Okay.
and that meeting of an equilibrium is I tend to think it has its uses, but it's completely absent in our macroeconomic vision. So the whole idea is, if you're a supplier and you have a certain amount of things, then you have to meet demand. And if you make too much, then you're going to end up at a loss and so on and so on. But there is a balance point
Mm.
within microeconomics that's completely absent in macroeconomics, where it's just seen as the sum of all interactions. And since we see the economy in a void, we can just keep growing and growing and growing and growing. So that's what I was
Okay.
saying at the beginning is like
Right.
it's almost like an anti-goal. There's no purpose in
Mm.
macroeconomics. So what is, to go back to Kate's book, she argues for is a change, is to acknowledge that there's a lack of a goal and that we should be much more intentional about stating what is the purpose of our economy as a whole.
Right.
And that's where essentially the donut comes in. So, and it's built upon this worldview I just mentioned, that the economy is embedded within society, but as well as embedded within our finite planet. So that's a given. So we need to
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge that reality. And given that that's the case, what type of economy do we want to have? And what the donut aims to do is to show that goal. So we would argue that the goal is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And
Which is
can,
amazing. Let's just say that again.
it's
Meeting the needs of all within the means of the living planet. So that was not a goal of economics.
No,
That was never
no,
stated, right? Um,
no. I mean,
yeah.
maybe like any scientific discipline, or certainly well, I'll just leave it there. Probably like any scientific discipline, there's been quite an attempt to set up the walls of what the discipline of economics is.
Hmm.
And of all the social sciences, I would argue economics is probably the most kind of, what's the word? Like orthodox, the
Mm.
most kind of,
Yeah,
there's
it
one
feels like
way.
it can't change or something, right? It feels like it's ordained, preordained.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are many, many different schools of economic thought, but what has happened is that there's one particular school, which is known as neoclassical economics, neoliberal economics,
Hmm.
that has arisen in the past, especially the last 50 years or so, and particularly since the 1980s, that has, I mean, really become hegemonic in the teaching of economics in universities and so on. There's many, many other types. I mean, I consider ecological economics to as an umbrella. It's very inclusive of many different what are yeah, schools of
Yeah,
thought,
I want to get
as
into that.
well
And I
as
know I'm smushing a lot of stuff together, but I feel like there's so much. So I'll stop for just a second and say the idea that you brought up with Herman Daly, right? I wonder, was that a breaking point from, let me just be a caricature, okay? That there was a kind of economics that was focused in a certain linear direction, as we sort of express, not really thinking about the goal, not really thinking about where this energy is coming from, not really thinking about energy, thinking more about just profit and growth. And then as if there were no boundaries, right? The box, thinking outside of the box, but not even having ever thought of the box or recognized the box. Or so that's how I'm imagining. Maybe I'm caricaturing a bit, but we have to, how economics was going, and especially in daily life, where it's just you just want more profit, your business to get better. You don't think about the planet or resources. And then he wrote this book, which was questioning growth, as I understand it a bit. Like, what is growth? Do we really we can't just imagine that we can suck up all the resources of the planet to fuel these businesses and then it's going to be fine, because what's coming back in, what's the timing on what's coming back in. And so I imagine this is a break, but am I imagining correctly that he was doing something very different with that book? Because I know Kate Raworth was inspired by that. That was one of the inspirations, I think.
definitely, definitely. So during this period, so Herman Daly was particularly writing starting at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s is when he started becoming active, and he had a very, very long career, up till the 2018 he was writing articles. He was interviewed in the New York Times actually. He just passed away in 2022. He was interviewed in the New York Times, I think a couple months, or I'm not sure exactly, but shortly before he passed away.
He's one of
So he
those
had a
names.
very
If
long.
you don't know anything about economics and you start looking around a little bit, he's everywhere. You
Oh
find
yeah? Well, that's great. That to
him.
me, that's just the best thing to
Yeah.
hear. Yeah, so he has been writing since the late 1960s, and that period, of course, was marked by, he wasn't the only one. I mean, one of a very foundational essay, it's excellent, by Kenneth Boulding in 1966, wrote an article called The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth. And it
Oh,
really
wow.
gets to the point that you were just talking about of like not recognizing boundaries. So he actually characterizes the cowboy economy is what we have, and the notion of the cowboy always on the frontier, and just this big open plains, and
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's a common, you're from Canada, right?
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
from Canada.
But this is a very American assumption that it's just the frontier and it's all open and there's no
Yeah, we
limit.
just need
Yeah.
to, yeah. And to be fair, that has been the experience of most of humanity. Like there's always been a place if you mess up something so badly that you can just sort of leave and go somewhere else. And it
It's
has
not that it's
been,
bad, but it's
yeah,
almost like a childlike assumption in a way.
yeah, exactly. And ultimately, it comes down to a question of scale, right? Like how we've now gotten to the point, and this is what Herman Daly and many ecological economists argue, is that we are now at the point where we're bumping up against very clear planetary limits, and that we can't afford to act
Yeah.
I mean, so as you just said, like childishly or immaturely, and we need to recognize that there are certain
Mm.
boundaries that our actions are pushing up against.
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, this is 1966. He juxtaposed the cowboy economy with the spaceman economy that we needed. And of course, this is in the context of the space race. So
Mm.
he could
Fascinating.
like he could acknowledge that as people are becoming aware of space travel, that the type of economy that you have on a spaceship is, I mean, just the polar opposite of the frontier, right? Like you have
Mhm.
what you have what you brought. If things break, then you better be able to fix them. Otherwise, you can't really
Yeah.
do anything. And
That
so
was around the
that's
time when we saw the Earth from above for the first time too, right? Where it
yeah,
was like, oh, this is a finite circle of delicate biosphere or something. Yeah.
yeah. So he wrote that essay in 1966. Another very classic milestone in the ecological economics world is the 1972 Limits to Growth book that
Mm.
was written by Dana Meadows and Dennis Meadows and Jürgen Randers, and there, which is like the first kind of simulated computer model, and it showed, it just used some equations and some understanding of what exponential growth of economic activity combined with population, combined with pollution, combined with various things and some pretty common sense assumptions could how that would play out by 2050. And they wrote, had a very, very famous model run that they called the standard run, which
Mm.
found or maybe it was 2100, which found essentially modeled a collapse due to buildup of pollution and mainly pollution actually, and also resource use. I
So
need to
this sounds
read
like
that.
bad news, or
Well,
how was this accepted? What did people think
well,
about this? Of
the
course, no
limits to
one.
growth, the
Hmm.
limits to growth book when it came out was hugely influential, and it generated a big kickback as well. It inspired a lot of people, but it
Hmm.
also created a lot of pushback
Reminds me
from
of Silent Spring a little bit with Rachel Carson. This kind
yeah.
of where everyone recognizes it's true, but that actually unleashes a
Yeah.
lot of negative and positive energy.
Exactly. So then for Silent Spring, then the pesticide companies are coming
Yeah,
out, and
exactly.
something very similar happened with limits to growth, and a lot of economists where because there's this techno optimist view
Hmm.
of in a lot of economy in economics that we can, the only thing that's limited is human ingenuity, that we
Hmm.
can solve our problems by like, harnessing innovation and just that's what we've always done, and that's what we will continually be able to do forever and ever.
Hmm.
Amen. And and so that Limits to Growth book was really, really influential. And there's an excellent podcast slash three-part series called, I think it's called Tipping Points, that it's like a mini crime scene investigation
Oh,
by the
wow.
people who by just it's an excellent piece of work.
It's
And
about
I
that
wish
book or about that time period or
it's it's about that book. It actually goes
oh, cool.
from the late 60s right up until 2023
Oh,
with looking at
wonderful.
footage. But what it
Try to
really
find it.
looks at the backlash to the limits to growth.
Hmm.
The run up to the publication, as well as the backlash, as well as the lasting impact that it has had.
Mm.
It's really, really good. I wish I could remember.
I'll find it, don't worry.
Cool. So all of that was taking place, just to answer your question I mean, I mean, I guess it's a niche crowd
Uh,
where Herman Daly was writing with Kenneth Boulding, with the Meadows, and with Rachel Carson, and
yeah,
had
yeah.
a major influence there as well.
And this was
But
not easy for them at the time. I think I heard Herman Daly once saying that he like couldn't take on PhD students and stuff, even like in the 70s and 80s and 90s because people were really not receptive. I think he was at the London School of Economics, maybe, or where was he? I don't know where he was. He was at some school, but it was very hard for him to get together people to defend the PhD because this other older inertia of economics as profit and not thinking about limits and boundaries of the planet and so on was still the main inertia. So this was like now I find that everywhere, right? It's changing. But at that time, it was new. It was getting a lot of attention, similar to Carson. There was also, I think, Elinor Ostrom and people starting to talk about the commons. There was this idea of complex systems, which in my field is now everywhere. And I think as many people talk about systems, but none of that was going on at the time, right? So at
Yeah.
that time, all of this was starting, but it was definitely not, as it is today, easy to find and words that we hear a lot.
Yeah, I would say that this would be a good time to go back to Kate's book because really her the goal that she set up for herself was almost to start um, pulling these threads together from different schools, recognizing that instead of saying, what is the economics that we're being taught and how do we make better choices based on that? She started with, what is the goal of the economy? And if we say that the goal of the economy is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet, then what is the best type of thinking that will take us towards that goal?
Mm.
And that's where, I mean, what she does is identify these 7 different ways and I can list them right now. The first one, changing the goal. So switching from that never-ending growth to living in the donut. And the donut is a visual framework that shows an ecological ceiling and a social foundation that makes a donut-shaped space that where we're not falling short of that social foundation, but also where we're not overshooting the ecological ceiling. So we want to live in the donut, and that visualizes the goal to meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet. That's just the goal. But then we also want to see the big picture. I was talking about the circular flow diagram. That's
Mm-hmm.
the biggest picture that you get in 20th century economics. We need to make that bigger. So we need to
Okay.
see the economy embedded in society, embedded in the living planet. But within the economy itself, she also recognizes other schools of economic thought. And this is where she identifies the market. Of course, that's the domain of neoliberal economics, and a lot of thought has gone into how markets work and how we can make them more efficient and how we can make them better.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of the thinking of how to make them better has been through the state, right? Through regulation,
Mm-hmm.
through if markets are failing, then that provides a justification for intervening in markets. And that is effectively was like the 20th century boxing match, right? Between are you a free market economist or are you like a communist who wants central planning for everything?
Oh
But
yeah.
of course,
Mm-hmm.
that misses like 2 other core parts of how we provision our goods and services, which is in the households. I mean, there's a whole branch of feminist economics and
Mm.
economics of care that recognize that we're not just workers, we're parents, we're carers, we're children, we're brothers, we're sisters,
Yeah.
we're neighbors, and that we don't just show up in a factory like boop all by itself. Like there's
Yeah.
a whole often invisible economy that goes into who's doing the washing and the cooking and the cleaning and that is primarily very gendered, still remains the case, and where women are often doing a lot of that invisible care work. And so that's
Yeah.
important. We need to make it visible. So she put it in
Yeah.
the, and the final one is the commons. We also need to recognize that, we're not just market states, households, which tend to be seen as like individuals and families and our relations between one another, but there's also the commons where we show up as stewards and as carers and as volunteers and as all those types of interactions at a community level where we're just engaging with one another without money changing hand, and which so much of our regular day-to-day life would fall apart if we didn't have the commons. And this is where she starts pulling in ideas, particularly around, I mean, Elinor Ostrom, institutional economics, and many others to
Mm-hmm.
recognize that, there are these 4 realms of provisioning, if you think about it within the economy. And each of those, I wouldn't want to live in any economy that didn't have, some elements of all of them. But the problem right now is that currently it's just disproportionately focused on market-based interactions to
Mm-hmm.
the detriment. I mean, then there's state, households, and commons.
Mm-hmm.
And
Let me
the
see if
last
I
point,
can get a kind of a grip because so we've got change the goal and see the big picture out of the seven in the book.
yeah,
And we've also talked a little bit about this older sense of economics and how it was changing and how the donut brings it together. Actually, the donut, as we're gonna, it's really a tool, right? Isn't it, for how to do a new kind of economics. And that new kind, which I've heard you just now express, is like, it's not saying something is necessarily wrong or right, but it's pulling back a bit like you described going into space. And we were talking about, we can see a bigger picture now. And that's all these different complex systems. I think Danilo Meadows was also an influence on Doughnut thinking, your thinking, Kate's thinking, and your team. So it's like, okay, let's pull back a bit. Let's look at all these different systems, women's part. There's so many things, right, that we could focus on and need to focus on. Also, as you were saying with Eleanor Ostrom, the commons that we share, this is one planet, and it is a commons at some level, and there's all kind of issues and problems with that, but taking that into consideration. So before the Doughnut economics model, a lot of people were doing a lot of work in all these fields, but it hadn't really been brought together into kind of a visual. And the Doughnut is a kind of visual of this, isn't it? It's actually showing us how we might be able to envision this a little bit differently than that linear model I was talking about at the beginning, where we just think about profit and a certain kind of growth. Is that right? Am I?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, really what the donut shows is, and why it's so powerful to me is because I mentioned those two rings, but the ecological ceiling itself is currently, it's informed by what's called the planetary boundaries framework. And that's these 9 planetary boundaries that leading Earth system scientists say regulate the stability of our planet using a complex systems approach. So they're recognizing the stability of the Earth system, and we should do well to stay within these bounds. That's directly ported onto the ecological ceiling of the donut. So it's the planetary boundaries. And then the social foundation are these 12 separate social dimensions which have been derived from the social priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals.
From the
So
UN
those,
and
what makes it powerful to me is that you can see all these different wedges that are forming the image, but you also see them in the context of a greater whole, right? Like, which is the donut.
yeah,
And so you can then attach numbers to that and show how we're doing with respect to the goal of living within the donut. And when you attach those numbers, you find that, we are very far from living in a situation of balance. We're far out of balance. We're
yeah.
overshooting 6 of the 9 planetary
So
boundaries.
nobody's in balance, right? No, none of
Right.
us. Yeah.
I mean, our economic system certainly is not in balance at
Yeah.
a
So
global
good.
level. And a lot of my work has been my research has been taking this global picture and bringing it down to the level of nations, because the global picture is useful to give a snapshot of all of humanity on
Mm-hmm.
our single planetary home. But if you're trying to actually start making different choices or trying to better understand policies and such, that often those policies are made at smaller scales because we don't have a very useful planetary governance system. And so what the donut at a global scale shows is really the goal, which is we want to live in the donut, and how we're doing with respect to it. So we think of it more like a compass, right? Like
Mm.
it's certainly not a map. It's not saying how do you get there or providing any indication there in that respect. So it's the word you used before, it's, I think, really useful. It's a tool. It's one tool, but it's not designed to solve all of these different things. So that's why it
Right.
comes in at the very first way to think, right? Is change the goal. So for that, use the donut. But for seeing the big picture, then we have a different visual, which is called the embedded economy diagram. And that shows what I was just speaking about before, the economy and society in the Earth system, households,
Mm-hmm.
commons.
Yeah.
For each of
And
these
yeah.
different 7 ways to think is, Kate and I are I've been very influenced by the power of visuals. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the, I guess, my passions, one of the things that I really aim to do is how we can use data in order to make visible this worldview that ecological economics and doughnut economics brings.
Yeah,
And
we should
so,
say you're the lead research and data analysis for the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And I'm going to link to all this. And I don't want you to feel like you have to explain everything because we can link. We don't have to go through all 7, although maybe we should say them. Change the goal, see the big picture, nurture human nature, get savvy with systems. We talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Design to distribute. I haven't talked about that yet. Create to
Nope.
regenerate, and be agnostic about growth, which we were getting at too. So we're not going to try to cover all this. There's a book, there's a bunch of beautiful visualizations and data. You've written amazing papers. The Dill Action Lab has a whole list of all 7 of them. So I'm going to link to that. But
Great.
at least we can start to think about all those. Because in your work, you use certain words like responsibility. You have this one, I think it's your well-being consumption paradox. These kind of issues I want to get into a little bit of. So we've tried to think bigger and think of the planet and think in systems, think of the commons, and of coming from this idea that let's not think just about growth and profit. Let's reevaluate. So and the donut's giving us a way to do that in lots of different ways. But I want to like look really at some of these words that you use, for example, like responsibility or the well-being consumption paradox. What are some of these like challenges and difficulties with these words and these ideas that affect all these different levels of thinking and action?
That's a great question. I mean, the power of words. I think
Yeah.
that so much of this work that we're doing is in a way trying to find the words to articulate the concepts that we haven't previously had to worry about, like this whole idea of
Mm,
from an empty world to a full world. So if we're in a full world, how do we talk about that
good
and
point. Yeah.
and bring the concepts home to people? So that's just an ongoing challenge.
The means of the living planet. Do people often, and you use the word boundaries, and this can feel like limits or limitations. And as you were saying, that's really against that cowboy mentality. But it's
Yeah.
also, they are different things, right? We could, if we reimagine what we think of as growth and what's possible, then it's not about being limited, even if there are boundaries and limits, right? How do you see that? The kind of paradox of consumption and well-being, or not necessarily being limited even though we recognize boundaries.
Yeah, I think about, again, this comes out of the donut, maybe a little bit more subtly, but it's almost the circular shape of a donut. I mean, the power of circles is quite well known through, I mean, they just show up again and again whenever you're talking about dynamic balance, the notion
Everywhere.
of a
Yeah.
circle, kind
Hmm.
of,
Loops.
or loops, or
Hmm.
kind of things within things that form kind of structured and balanced type
Hmm.
of images. So the donut, I feel, embodies that a little bit, and that helps to get at that idea that you were sort of hinting at. There's actually a book by a friend and colleague in the ecological economics world called Limits by Yorgos Kallis. And he published it a few years ago now. And I think it's a really useful contribution. It helped me to come to grips with this question of limits. Like if they're being imposed from outside, then you feel like you're getting, shoved in a box.
Hmm.
Versus, I think that a lot of if your goal is to live in a type of dynamic balance with other human beings and the rest of the living world, then limits isn't so much about being imposed from without, it's being imposed out of respect for others from within, right? It's like a
Yeah.
self-restraint
Right.
that that I mean that
It's
you
almost like
do.
being disciplined can make you freer in a way if you've ever done a martial art or something.
Yeah, no, I haven't, but I would not be surprised if martial arts and I mean these ideas are millennia old if you look to
Hmm.
other ways of knowing and ways of being that so a lot of this stuff is not new. What is perhaps the most new, and I can speak with my economics background, is relearning these concepts into the discipline of economics, which of course has had such a profound influence on the global system that has been created. So we need to relearn these concepts that have been understood for a very, very long time. And we've heard from other, I mean, indigenous thought leaders in Hawaii and Canada as well. I've been very, very, I mean, touched, very mm, influenced by them approaching the donut as a as like a potential bridge framework that they see as one of the more useful frameworks that can bridge indigenous ways of knowing and being with, because the donut is a Western built kind of concept, but it could act as that bridge to help communicate these different ways of
That's really
knowing.
interesting. That's so you've had some dialogues that are
Definitely,
bridges. Yeah.
definitely. And they to me they mean so much to me because
Yeah.
that's, I mean, where I'd like our thinking to go, but then how do we get there given all of the Western baggage that we come along with?
Yeah,
And
maybe I mean like maybe we can dip into you a bit here now too. Like why is that meaningful for you, this bridge? And how did you get into this? And how did you discover ecological, because you're an ecological economist. I'm not sure I know exactly what that means or how it relates to an environmental ecologist or if these are different, but maybe I
oh,
you can tell me how you found it. How did you get here? Yeah.
so there is a difference between ecological economics and environmental economics. It's pretty easily explained. One, environmental economics is part of neoclassical economics, and it's all
Okay.
about fixing the externalities, right? If there are market
Yeah, right.
failures, then we need to internalize the externalities, whereas most ecological economists are not very keen with that framing
Mm-hmm.
because the whole language of externalities is that worldview that sees the economy as everything. So if something's not there, then we need to bring it in. And then
Mm.
only then will the economy actually be everything. Whereas,
So that it is about that thinking of internal and external in an almost dichotomous way rather than systems or
yeah, I mean, to me, that's the core. Is as soon as you hear someone talking about externalities and internalizing, they have
mm-hmm.
a vision of the economy that is the whole,
Mm.
right? So that the only way they can conceptualize it is by bringing it in. And the way to do that is by valuing it in usually in some type of hypothetical market scenario that works with the neoclassical assumptions that
That's a very
underpin
good
it.
point. Was there a time
And
when you thought like that of external, internal, and
definitely, definitely. I was 6 years, so I did my undergrad in in economics and international development studies. So
oh,
international development studies is it's quite a critical social science, whereas economics is like the least critical social science. So when I
hmm.
was doing my undergrad, I was just being like ripped into pieces
Mm.
because international development studies is a lot of I mean, it's very critical of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. There's different theories that have tried to explain how developing countries, which is a term I don't use anymore,
Yeah.
lower
Mm.
income or middle income countries should catch up with the rich countries of the West. So there's something called modernization theory, which kind of underpins a lot of how these big multilateral institutions act.
So you were
Um,
sort of in that you were looking at the behavior of all these giant organizations and deconstructing it a bit. I mean, what do you mean it was like pulling you apart? Was it just,
so
yeah.
So I guess what I meant to say is one economic worldview is what the World Bank and the International Monetary Funds and departments of economics teach,
Hmm.
which is essentially a growth-based mindset that countries are poor because they don't have good institutions, because they like don't have the infrastructure in place that they need to, do all these things in order to be able to grow. And when they grow, they'll have more income and they'll be able to satisfy their needs.
I
Whereas
see.
a much more nuanced understanding of the global economic system would actually acknowledge that there have been centuries of extraction and domination by some, generally Western Europe, now North America, a few Western societies with respect to the rest, which is
Mm.
often called the global south. And so there's things called dependency theory, there's world systems theory, there's this recognition of the core, which is extracting resources and labor in order to benefit itself from the periphery and all of this stuff. So this is what
So,
international development
so
studies.
you were studying all of that
So I was
yeah,
studying that while at the same time, economics is
yeah.
actively promoting
Oh, now
the
I see
like
why you were being pulled.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's, yeah.
So I was learning that. I guess it's also relevant to mention my mother was born in Guyana,
Uh,
and so she emigrated to Canada for university, and and so I a part I mean, I guess it's an otherwise invisible part of me because I don't really present or have an identity
Yeah,
that's
but I think
very clearly
must be very
Caribbean, but
important.
she has 10 brothers and sisters, and
Wow.
they're all scattered about the Caribbean and a lot of them in Canada as well, but they are much more deeply tied to the Caribbean community in Canada. And so that's a part of my upbringing that that has always, that's very meaningful for
And what
me.
do you associate with that? I mean, it sounds like that's a complex system, a lot of things going on, but also a different kind of wisdom, just geographically, but in many ways. So did you already sort of see that there were a lot of different ways to come at something, or what's the richness there? Because I feel it in your expression, but
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess well, it's hard for me to distinguish between that as well as another part of my childhood where I lived for 4 years in the country of Belize,
oh
from when
wow.
I was 7 until I was 11. So that was
Oh, what years
pretty,
to live there. You have a great
yeah.
memory then. So you
So
really vivid.
those were really formative, I guess a formative part of my upbringing because
Hmm.
then I remember living in Belize, and of course it has its own, like, as a relatively low income country. It's not what you would find in Canada. But I also one of the things I remember most actually is coming back to Canada. And when you're a kid, you really kids can fit in relatively quickly in a
Hmm.
lot of different contexts. And so when I showed back up in Canada, I remember having a Caribbean accent and like just not fitting
Yeah.
in the type of Canadian neighborhood that I had then moved to. And
And
I do
you had the
remember,
feeling like you recognized, okay,
yeah,
yeah.
we lived in one house for a year, and I think of that year as like my reintegration time, and I'm actually grateful. Well, you never know. I'm grateful that we after that year we then moved to a different school in a different
Hmm.
area, and so I could almost like sort of I
Start
landed
over.
in Canada and I learned how to skate and I learned how to, I kind of relearned my more Canadian accent and
Oh,
all of that kind of cultural learning that I had to go through. And then we just picked up and moved somewhere else.
that's
And
fascinating.
at
As
that
someone
point,
who moved a lot, I can really appreciate that because, yeah, you almost had a year to retrain yourself, reacclimate, and
yeah,
then start over again.
yeah. And then I wasn't weird like Caribbean guy
Yeah,
who
yeah, yeah.
in the other place.
We moved a lot when I was a kid too, and it teaches you something about shifts of perspective, about complex systems, about the commons, about needing ways to deal with your environment. But I wonder, when you were studying the development and the economics and you were feeling all of this coming out of that background, were you looking for some third way or
Yeah.
place to resolve it or?
Well, one of my conclusions from seeing the economics versus international development studies stuff is I felt maybe my naive, maybe my whatever, I was 20s, early 20s, feeling that neither of these approaches, although I was much more aligned with the international development studies thinking and
Mm-hmm.
is more progressive and it accounts for exploitations and
Mm-hmm.
vulnerabilities and things both approaches were kind of like neither of them could ever be like fully right. Like that they at the end of the day they were both visions of the world that were at their core kind of social constructs, their social stories
Yeah.
that that I felt were not going to provide an answer. Like there is just being an eternal struggle between them. And I was reconciled to that. After that, I took some time off and I was bouncing around, but I went back to do a master's in development economics. And that was fully in the Department of Economics. But one of the reasons for that is because I felt that I didn't have sufficient kind of expertise.
Huh.
I've never considered myself a very academic person at all. So I finished my bachelor's and I wanted to go to work. But then I found after some years that like actually that like I didn't have this skill set on my CV that was opening any door. So I went back
Huh.
to do this 2-year master's program with the idea that that could then be like you could then, because it's 2 years, many master's programs are one, that
Wow.
that could provide more practical skills. So I was into my second year of this 2 year program when I wanted to take a course in environmental economics, actually. So I was, but
Did
my
you know what it
department,
was? Or yeah. Or was it
yeah,
more the two
yeah,
words together? Yeah.
I knew what it was, and I knew I was starting to become more concerned about
Mm-hmm.
environmental issues. I
Yeah.
wanted to get some groundedness, but my department, just to give an indication of the importance that many departments of economics place on the environment, they weren't even offering a course
Oh.
in at the graduate level that semester that I wanted to take it. And so I started looking around and I found a course called Economics for Resource and Environmental Management, which was being offered in the School of Resource and Environmental Studies in a different department. And I was sort of just
Okay.
like, well, that sounds like that sounds like what I want. So I wrote the prof
Hmm.
and asked, hey, can I join this course because they're not offering one? I know I'm not in the same department, but and he was like, well, I mean, economists, you probably have more of a background than this course is aimed for, but yeah, if you want to join it, for sure. And I did, and it was a course of about 30 students, most from with natural science backgrounds, so like physics and engineering and environmental studies and all of that
Huh.
stuff. And it was a course in ecological economics. It was talking about these limits to growth. It was talking about all the things that we've been talking about here
Oh,
today,
wow.
for the most part, planetary boundaries, ecological footprint, all of
So is
these
that where you
concepts.
would read something like Herman Daly or
It was
yeah.
find Herman Daly, and it blew my mind. I remember, like, because, and I remember looking around at one point and seeing all the other students, and they're all just like, "Yeah, of course, you can't grow forever on a finite planet. Like, are you an idiot?" Like, they just saw these ideas as so common sense, and it's true, they are. But I was just like, "This is like revolutionary for the stuff that I've been learning." And
I think
so,
that's a really important point because we can only imagine what we know. I mean, you're coming out of a certain training and that's just the training and then you go into this other environment and it's like, oh, there's a whole other way of thinking about this. Did it feel more like resonant or closer to what you'd experienced or something when you heard it or
well, to me, I was just hooked. I just started
yeah.
reading and reading and reading, and just there was a decent amount of, because a lot of the ecological economics literature, it's not mainstream and it's not taught to many economics students, but it's also very critical of kind of mainstream economics. And there were
Oh,
these
okay.
critiques being lobbed at the discipline that I had been studying that I had never come across before. And
Oh,
there was a decent amount of like just anger. Like I
yeah.
felt like blinded
Hmm.
by, because like I was just not allowed to see these things that, and I felt stupid because it never really occurred to me. But I guess as a student, like it's
Yeah,
hard
but you're
to,
being trained, you're being oriented and
yeah, it's
reading
hard to
tons of
know
stuff
what,
by experts, you know?
yeah, it's hard to see what's not there. Like it's
It is.
so
Even when
anyway,
it's
that
most
that
obvious, I think. And you're not, I've heard that before where the ecological economics is actually very intuitive in terms of like how we feel and experience the world if, you know, if you're taught that early. But most people are trained in the almost opposite mindset. So you never really like get in touch with that.
yeah.
So you were looking for environmental economics, you found ecological economics.
Found
By
that. That was the red pill in the matrix, if you
yeah.
will. And yeah, just started asking more questions and reading more, and had an opportunity to pursue, well, yeah, I just, one thing in my personal life, my partner and I, right around that time when I was finishing my master's, we had our first daughter, and we moved
Oh,
to
another
Spain.
life-changing, a lot of life-changing events there.
Yeah, yeah. So that was a big one. So I finished the master's. The whole purpose was to not go back to school because I didn't want to do school because I'm not an academic, because but I moved to Spain in 2012, which for anyone who's familiar with that period of time in Spain, it was not a good time to go to try to find work. 2012, like Spain was very hard hit. for a few years after the great financial recession.
Right.
And one of the best job opportunities that I could find is a fully funded PhD contract through. So even just looking at it from a labor market perspective, I had been working on like 3 month, 6 month contracts as an English teacher, as different
Mm-hmm.
jobs that I picked up. And this was a 3 year contract, which was already in and of itself like the best thing that I could find. And then at the end of it, I could design whatever I wanted to do, as well as get a PhD at the end. So it was just a no-brainer.
Oh,
And and so I had
wonderful.
already been exposed to these ideas of ecological economics. So I wrote a proposal that could dive deeper into that. And that allowed me to dig a bit deeper and start on the path that I
Wow,
find
that was
myself on
good.
now.
That was a really important time in your life. Do you see that as sort of setting you up? I guess what I want to try to do is link this personal story and all of this change and transformation to also the kind of transformation you were studying and this way of approaching the world. Like, I feel like your work is more to you than, just work. Like there's a vision to it. And that seems very tied in with donut economics for me, that it changes your life. I don't think studying economics in that sense of when I imagine someone studying it way back might have had that feeling, but when you encounter something like Daly or Ostrom or now you and Raworth, there's something life-changing in it. I don't know if I can connect that a little bit because your life was already changing and you were doing this. But do any thoughts come to mind when I say all of that? Is it a personal?
Yeah, I think it's funny when I think of my own life. I tend to think of myself more as sort of bumbling along with a whole bunch of privilege is what, as a side
Yeah.
note, a journey that I'm on at the right now is trying to come to grips with the amount of privilege that I hold just from where I
Hmm.
was born and what I look like and the identity that I hold. But that's a side thing. But in general, as I've been bumbling along through my 20s and 30s, it was I guess I've always been working, like since I mean, very typical 13-year-old who had a paper route. And then I
Uh,
was landscaping and then supermarkets and then this and that. And I've had a lot of different types of jobs and I've never been particularly like tied to a career aspiration or anything like that. And so one of the things that I have picked up, I think, is just I've enjoyed all of the jobs that I've had. I just tend to enjoy working and just doing a good job, I'd
that's
say
good.
is which is good and bad. And I'm thankful for the trajectory that I've gone towards because I feel like I have meaning and purpose and that I'm working towards the right thing. But I could have very easily been like doing a good job in something that is like much less.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. There was
Yeah,
something in you that wanted to reconcile a
yeah,
lot of that stuff early on, so I'm not sure. But I see what you're saying. You're not
yeah. You
being
never
really
know.
aggressive about planning your life or something.
Yeah, so I tend to see it as just sort of like one thing after another, and this is what has led me to where I am today. I'm just very, very fortunate throughout. Finding ecological economics was definitely a key moment because that I was just like, there's nothing else I want to study or do
Mm-hmm.
besides this.
Yeah.
And then the PhD opportunity, I reached out to a friend and colleague now, Dan O'Neill, and he wasn't at the university that I was at, but I asked him if he would be willing to co-supervise my PhD because the university I was at didn't have an ecological economist to actually like conceptually support my research.
Wow.
And he agreed. And so that led to just a really a really like great relationship with
Meaningful,
him.
and yeah, it sounds like
And
very good timing.
he invited me to join an analysis that he was doing on looking at basically the level of resource use associated with achieving a high level of social performance, a high level of human well-being across countries. And this was back
Mm-hmm.
in 2015. And
Wow.
he invited me into this paper that he was writing with Julia Steinberger and Will Lamb and
Hmm.
Dan and myself. And I got hooked on that, that I was just recognizing the cross-country analyses and doing data visualization and just really seeing the power of making visible these concepts, right? Because it's talking about what is the level of resource use, how sustainable is it, what's the level of social performance, and is it like sufficient? Is it dignified? Is it, and putting those two together,
Mm.
and we ended up with a publication in 2018, which came out just very shortly after Kate's book.
Yeah.
But we were
Mm.
obviously inspired by her previous report, which was published in 2012. So we were working off that. And we always joke, actually, is like anytime we plan to write like a major high impact paper related to a concept, we should make sure that the leader of that concept publishes a bestseller like just a few months
Just, yeah,
before.
no problem. Easy.
And
Yeah.
yeah, your impact goes way up when you if you can do that. But
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up because you got on this wave, you caught this wave, or this wave caught you, whatever. And it really was amazing timing because when she first came up with these ideas, was it 2012? I don't think they were accepted, at least not in the establishment, very well. Kind of in a similar way, maybe, to what we were talking about before. Resonating a lot, but also, pushback. At least that's how I understand it. But then by late, like 2018 or so, obviously there were people in the world who really wanted this. And when the book came out, by then there was a wave, and a lot of people are very interested in this now, and it is changing things. And I guess before we end, I want to get to that because, you're working now together, you're doing your own work, and there's so much we haven't talked about. I wanted to get into well-being, but anyway, but now all this is coming together and it does have a real impact. And that impact is on that earth that we talked about at the beginning. And yeah, I wonder how you see that, like that you've ended up in this place where there is real change is being made. At least it seems like that for me. The Action Lab, you're working at the Action Lab. Yeah, how do you see that? Like, I guess that just naturally came into your life too. How do you feel about being part of something that actually is having really real impact on the future and how it might actually change the way we think about economics in a very big way?
my brain's just like, no. No,
Yeah.
I'd feel incredibly privileged and humbled to be a part
It doesn't
of
feel like
this
that
work.
to you, that it's a big impact, or?
Sometimes when I see the work, I mean, the interest and the opportunities that arise within Doughnut Economics Action Lab, thanks to Kate's conceptual leadership, thanks to just the very hardworking team that we have who are working in business and communities and cities. I'm leading the more research and academia and data analysis part. But we have a fairly small team. Our public-facing team is, I think, we're 8 people. And so each of us is holding a theme, but we don't have like a team behind us. It's one person. And
Hmm.
so when you think of that and then start looking at how much each of those people are responding to and how much energy and how many invitations we receive and how much we're trying to support people's efforts and that we just don't have the capacity to do everything. But we also don't want to be a gigantic organization. What we want to
Hmm.
do is actually provide tools and share stories and examples that other people can pick up and adapt and apply and put them in their own context. So everything at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, the tools that we create are in the commons. Anyone can use them. They can adapt them. All we ask in return is that people share back their innovations on the platform. So people, when you join, you can become a member. You can, contribute tools, contribute stories and events and all of that stuff. And I've come to think that process of peer-to-peer inspiration is actually one of the forces, if we talk about systems and feedbacks and all of that, could be one of the feedbacks that might be strong enough to turn this gigantic, degenerative and divisive economic system that we currently have towards, a trajectory moving towards the donut. Because yeah, I listen to Kate speak and I think many other people do as well, and it's just like, wow, this makes so much sense. But I think that so much like that person who's on the TED stage or who's on some stage can only get so far, actually. When you see a mayor and you are a mayor, or when you see a teacher and you're a teacher and they're doing that thing that you didn't think about before, then that can actually be far more inspiring and or can open up much more opportunity for action than that brilliant person on the TED stage, if that makes sense at all.
Makes a lot of
So
sense. It's very
so
well
being a
said.
part of that is huge. I consider my small role is I'm a data nerd. Like I'm just this sort of nerdy guy in the corner who I was very another formative thing that, and I guess we'll probably get to closing, but a formative thing for me was learning how to create interactive data visualizations. So one of the things with that first paper I was mentioning with all these different countries is I led a project to develop visualizations that people could go, we're all very used to it now, right? Is like there's a chart, you can select a country, you can see da da da, like, but the process of learning how to create those
Hmm.
visualizations for me was just such a, well, I think a very useful skill because it just takes particularly academic knowledge or data-led knowledge where people don't read journal articles, or that's not how many people take in their information. But if you provide an interactive website or an interactive tool that people can engage with and select and move around, then I think that like I'm very pleased. That's actually how I met Kate, is
Okay.
because I was leading that project to create these national donuts, and we asked for her design input. Really, we're like, hey, if we're gonna create this thing, can you share any thoughts or comments or suggestions, or how can we make this as useful as possible? And I remember having a meeting with her at the University of Leeds, and just a funny story where she didn't, there was a mix up and we didn't know where to meet, and somehow she had my number. And so I just have this really clear memory of running across the University of Leeds campus to go meet Kate Raworth to show her this like pilot website that we were creating.
That's
But
beautiful. I did want to talk about the visualization because that is a big part of it, the analyzing of the data and then the making of that data into something visual that makes sense to people. I think it makes sense that it brought you and Kate together because that's what she did too, in a way, is assimilate a whole bunch of data and put it together in a new way and make it visually and also in words, I mean symbolically with words, accessible. Do you think that's true? Do you see that connection? And yeah, how did you start? When did you? It sounds to me like you just must have a natural gift for being able to do that kind of visualization, or was it a lot of training?
it was it was a lot of time.
Okay.
Coursera, those massive open online courses. So I
Ah, okay. I've
basically
done those,
just
yeah.
I had something that I wanted to do. I was fortunate enough to apply for a little bit of funding in order to create that idea, which was the interactive website. And we did it together, Dan O'Neill. And so we applied for this funding basically to be able to hire someone who could develop the website. And then we hired me because I
Well,
wanted to learn how to do that. But
where does that come
um,
from? Why,
it was
why did
certainly
you
not cost
understand the power
effective.
of visualization? Was it just a hunch
Um,
or?
Well, it came from the visualizations that we created for the paper. But of course, many scientific articles they're static images and then
Hmm.
the information, maybe there's a supplementary data spreadsheet
Hmm.
or something, but oftentimes the results are not very accessible. And so actually no, Will Lamb, who's one of the other co-authors, he actually created the very first national donuts for that paper. And he did it using an interactive visualization tool, like a web-based tool.
Oh, okay.
And I remember writing
Mhm.
or t being in a meeting with him or sending him an email or something and being just like, what we should totally do, Will, is just like, you could just make a website that makes all of this available. And he was just like, that's so much work. Like I have a job and I can't do that. And I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially he was like, yeah, good idea, but I'm already fully employed. And and that was the thing where it was just like, okay, well, maybe I should do it. I don't actually know how to do that, but and so I taught myself.
That's inspiring though, but then you just learned. So you were motivated, you saw it, and yeah, I think it makes a big difference. I mean, we do need to go, and but I do something we didn't even talk about was I brought up this idea of the seven ways of thinking because it's funny because they're all actually actions, I think. I mean, I read them off: change the goal, see the big picture, nurture human. They're all actions, but it's actually a way of thinking. And I was going to bring it up to you that I see the visualization as somehow kind of the place where that meets in a way. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe it's too philosophical, but just in your experience, we've talked about all of this. We've there's so much more that people are just going to have to go explore, but the donut model is like about how do we meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet, which doesn't necessarily have to mean limits, but it does mean rethinking our place and what's possible. And it's these seven ways of thinking are also sort of calls to action about how to do that. And there, nobody's saying, as you said at the beginning, you and Kate and all your work, no one's saying you have to do it this way, but it's this, perhaps if we change our ways of thinking, these other actions become possible and the visualizations go with that. How have you seen like that relationship? Where have you seen the real change? Like for you, it seems like it was in the visualization. Have you seen that with others too, when they see the donut and or they see the work that you've done? Is it inspiring a change of thought, which is also a change of action?
I think that I've seen some of the visualizations that we've created, the donut being the key example that makes people like it just hits a different part of your brain
Yeah.
or something that you can see something. And that cross country there's a scatter plot that we produce that looks at the number of biophysical boundaries that a country transgresses compared to the number of social boundaries that it achieves. And the donut is, of course, we want to achieve all the social boundaries without transgressing any of the ecological ones.
Ecological.
And what it ends up being is the donut is in the upper left corner, which actually in and of itself, I think is compared to the 20th century version where, we very typically go, what's the trajectory your progress is like from the bottom left to the top right, right? Like
True, true, true.
that
Yeah.
curve of growth. So the fact that this scatter plot put where we want to be in the top left, I think even that was a shift. It helped to do a
Ah,
shift
I
in
hadn't thought of that.
perspective.
That's really true. It does, yeah, it opens up a whole other space. It literally flips the script.
Yeah, and also what that also showed was that scatter plot just it looks like if you plot the countries with respect to where that should be, it just looks like there's a magnet repelling like the anti-poles
Yeah,
of
true,
a
true.
magnet just pushing nations away. They're just in this
Mm-hmm.
completely here's where we want to be and just along the bottom and up along the top, but no one is even close to actually being in that space.
It is
And so
amazing how
I
that
think
visualization does give you a different way to think about it.
yeah, yeah. So I think that that has been a powerful, I mean, I certainly don't take credit for it or anything. It was
Well,
just something that came out of our work that I find has been very, very powerful for helping to like we can see it when we give presentations and we give talks and you can see in the audience people just like it clicking almost. And then
mm-hmm.
I think that that's a very important, an important click that needs to be made. And so I guess a lot of my work or my ambition is to try to find as many of those that are aligned with the world, the vision of donut economics as I
Well,
can.
that's great. It's good work to be doing. And it does remind me of the moment in your ecological economics class. I think a lot of us need these really actually what look like obvious and simple changes of thought, which are also changes of action. But because they're so obvious and simple, weirdly don't see them unless we get something like that visual. So it's really delicate and nuanced how what might seem very obvious and simple to some people who've had a certain trajectory in life is just never seen by others. But all it might take is a certain visualization to shift that. So, is there any kind of last things you want to say or anything we didn't talk about that you want to make sure we say?
No, I think there's been a really, really great conversation that we've ranged across most of the things that are important to me. We talked about Doughnut Economics Action Lab, the platform that is there, doughuteconomics.org, the National Donuts website, which is
Yeah.
goodlife.leeds.ac.uk, where you can explore the results of our research using those visualizations. And yeah, please do join the Doughnut Economics Action Lab community where I think so much of this work is just making visible in different ways the many, many, many people who care, and because sometimes you can feel pretty lonely,
Mm.
and but actually it's not the case.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up too. And this idea of care, because there's a lot of that in it. It is about there's definitely an element of really caring and deepening your connection and care. Just I wonder if I want to link to some of your papers. Which papers would you really most
Well,
want
one that
to?
was really, really meaningful for me was the one we published last year with Jason Hickel, which is called Compensation for Atmospheric Appropriation. And
Oh,
that's where we
okay.
really dove into historical responsibilities for climate breakdown, and we proposed a mechanism for global north countries who are overwhelmingly responsible for this breakdown to actually compensate countries who have not contributed or very little to nothing to climate change. And so that one means a lot to me because that was almost like a coming back to my international development studies thing that
Absolutely. I was just thinking that. Yeah.
uh, I noticed, well, at first when I discovered ecological economics, because the international development stuff is actually a relatively new piece that Jason Hickel in particular has been instrumental in bringing. It's the international development kind of critique that he married with ecological economics. So I really resonated with him bringing that because I had a whole undergrad that I had been looking at that I had essentially put to the side as I was learning the more biophysical or quantitative stuff. So
Yeah.
getting back to that was
It's
was
strange.
really
It's almost
meaningful.
like your contribution in that field is coming together, even though you had to leave that field to leave it in a way, but diverge.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, interesting. And also that's two nodes coming together. So maybe that's the next kind of visualization.
Yeah, maybe.
All right, it's been great to talk to you and very inspiring, and thanks for sharing your story and thanks for the work you're doing. Really appreciate it. It's definitely changed the way I think about economics, all of it, the whole Doughnut Action Lab and all that you are synergizing there together. So good luck and thanks for doing it. I know it must be tons of work, but it's appreciated. And I do think it's making a difference.
Thank you very much. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation. So thanks for taking us all the places that we went.
Thanks for going along with it. I know it was a lot, but I really wanted to get as much in as I could because it's so exciting.